Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Another webinar in our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Today is all about packaging sustainability. We call it Packaging Sustainability Unwrapped deliberately. We're not talking about sustainable packaging. And I think Helen and Jeff might have a few words to say to that as well. I will leave that to them. Let's get going. And my name's Barbara. I'm the host for the next half an hour for you today. I'll introduce our guests. We have two guests today. We have Helen Lewis, and Helen is an expert in packaging sustainability. She runs her own business, is providing research and strategic advice to industry and government clients. She's also an adjunct professor with the Institute of Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology in Sydney. She's got a lot of experience in packaging sustainability and actually co-authored the first book on design and environment already in 2001. So really very much looking forward to hearing from your wealth of experience. Also joining us is my colleague Jeff Vickers. He's Technical Director here at Thinkstep-anz. A warm welcome to you and a warm welcome to all of you out there listening to us today. The huge interest in packaging sustainability shows me that the topic, even though COVID-19 has happened, is not off the table, which is very encouraging. So welcome to you all. Before we get started, we'd quite like to get to know our audience a bit better. So we've put a few questions up for you. We'd like to know, who are you? Which group do you most closely identify with? So if you could all tick this, then I'll share the results and we'll know who's listening in, who are we having a conversation with. We have got a fair few manufacturers. We have some packaging manufacturers. We have food and beverage, and we have quite a few who are just interested. So warm welcome to all of you. We'd also be really keen to see what changes have you experienced or are you expecting in the packaging area as a result of COVID-19. Do you think people will have more demand, less demand? That's just interesting for us to know. Probably increased demand. I'll share the results in a moment. It's leveling out between same demand and increased demand. So yeah, there is a little bit of an increased demand, so that's quite interesting. Even more relevant that we do that additional packaging that will be required in a sustainable way. A couple more questions. Who, in your view, in your experience, is actually driving the change in packaging sustainability? Who are the key stakeholders who have an interest? It seems that the final consumers are the main driver. Quite a few internal staff as well. That's interesting as well. And what we will do is, when we do a recording of the webinar, we will share those results with you. But with nearly 60%, it's the final consumers who really are driving that change. And not really so much government policy. Last question for you is, what changes are these stakeholders requesting? And you can tick here all the ones that are relevant for you. Recyclable packaging, but also generally improving packaging sustainability scores quite highly. That was really interesting. Hopefully, Helen and Jeff, that gives you a bit of an insight as well. And then I'll just hand over to you, Helen.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. A while ago, the president and CEO of Coca-Cola was quoted as saying that the world has a packaging problem, and like all companies, we have a responsibility to help solve it. Now, that's a really admirable sentiment, but I'd go further and say that there's a strong business case for packaging sustainability. The business case varies between companies, but there are a few common drivers shown there on the screen. Efficiency is a big one, for example, by reducing packaging materials and associated labour costs. Access to raw materials, which may reduce the risks of supply or price volatility. Compliance with environmental regulations, which didn't come out as a strong driver in the poll before. meeting consumer expectations, which did come up as a major driver, finding new market opportunities, maintaining or enhancing reputation, or sometimes in response to shareholder action, and that's a particular driver in the US. I'll just provide a few examples of that. The first is compliance, which is the bare minimum, of course, and if you're operating in Australia, that means the Australian Packaging Covenant, but there are more regulations coming in, as many of you would know. We've got bans on single-use retail shopping bags, bans on single-use plastic packaging, such as straws and some foodware, and these are being introduced in Australia and New Zealand. And container deposit schemes, which are becoming nationwide in Australia. Efficiency gains are delivering a strong business case for many businesses. That's driven by many things, of course. But here's one example that I like. In 2008, hardware retailer Bunnings did a big audit of their packaging to look for opportunities for improvement. And they found a lot of opportunities for reduced over-packaging. As you'll know, many products in hardware stores don't need much packaging, so there are many opportunities. The one that's shown here is the wrenches that used to be individually wrapped in plastic film and then unitized in a PVC bag. The new packaging on the right there is very minimal, a product cable to hold them together and a swing tag. So simple. A more important driver, as it sounds like many of you know, for many of the bigger brands is to meet customer expectations. This one's from 2015, this survey. It was 30,000 people in 60 countries who asked how much influence each of these factors has on your purchasing decisions. And around 41% said they were influenced by the product having environmentally friendly packaging. So this is pretty old data now, but all the surveys I've seen since have a similar result. Two of the consumer pet hates are over-packaging and non-recyclability. And I love this one because this is such a polite criticism from consumers. Dear Amazon packaging department, you may have gone a little bit overboard on protecting this Burt's Bees lotion. I'm not sure that this box or the amount of protection was needed, but thanks for being overcautious. And if, like me, you've been doing some online shopping in the last couple of months, you'll have seen some similar examples. Market opportunities. With so much interest in more sustainable packaging solutions, there are plenty of business opportunities. This is just one in the coffee cups, the ubiquitous coffee cups, over 1 billion used in Australia every year, most go to landfill. Detmold, for example, has developed their Recycle Me product range, which includes a cup with a detachable liner that won't stop the fibre being recycled. And they've also got a collection network. Other companies are developing reusable, recyclable or compostable packaging for coffee, such as our friends at BioPack on the right there. Reusable cups are becoming ubiquitous. The founder of Keep Cup, which was the first barista-ready reusable cup, said that her business doubled overnight after the ABC's War on Waste TV show profiled disposable cups. But we're also seeing lots more innovative models for leasing or sharing coffee cups. So for most companies, the business case is strong and getting stronger, but a strategic response is essential to make sure that you're getting the business benefits. 4 steps are shown here. You can do this in many different ways, but research, developing the strategy, integrating the strategy into your business, and then public reporting. The step that's not shown here is continuous improvement, which of course needs to be part of that. And I'll talk about each of these very briefly. Next slide, getting started. So background research, this is where life cycle thinking comes in. You need to understand the life cycle impacts of your packaging, for example, by using extensive design guidelines or streamlined LCA tools, researching consumer and stakeholder expectations. You need to understand your compliance obligations, of course, benchmark against your competitors and your peers and confirm where you want to be positioned in relation to them. Very importantly, investigate opportunities to link your strategy to other business goals and processes. For example, consumer complaints about packaging. Can you address these at the same time? Business improvement processes. Can you link your packaging sustainability to productivity or cost targets or new product development? All of this research helps to confirm the business case for packaging sustainability within your organisation and your strategy going forward. One of the most important tasks in developing a strategy is to identify the appropriate goals and targets. For example, Unilever has a target that by 2025, all of their plastic packaging will be reusable, recyclable, or compostable. This target has been adopted by hundreds of brands worldwide, including many in Australia and New Zealand. Another example, a different approach, is Countdown, who in 2017 announced a series of commitments under the headings People, Planet and Prosperity. And under Planet, some of their goals were, or targets were, moving towards zero food waste to landfill, improving recyclability of their own brand packaging, and achieving zero supply chain deforestation for high impact commodities in their own brand products. The business case and your specific goals and targets will form the basis of your strategy. However, a strategy will only be effective if it's integrated across all the functions and roles within your organisation that are responsible for implementation. Here are just a few of the key ones. Product development team, of course, need to review all of the packaging against targets and checklists, which is only going to happen if it's documented in policies and procedures. Procurement, building sustainability into specifications and contracts. Marketing, they need to develop and implement strategies to determine their right product mix and to work out how to market and communicate sustainability features, including labelling. And finally, reporting, you need to measure and monitor progress and report publicly. I mentioned Unilever earlier. This is just an extract from their public report. They committed to halving the waste associated with disposal of their products by 2020. They'd achieved 29% when they reported here, but they very importantly also explained all of the challenges that they were experiencing, such as getting consumers to recycle and having the right infrastructure in place. Consumers generally appreciate honesty and transparency. So just some final comments before I hand over. There's generally a strong business case for packaging sustainability, but you need to understand the drivers, risks and opportunities for your business and your supply chain to refine and communicate the business case internally. Industry leaders are going well beyond compliance and positioning for the future, whether that's driven by consumer interest, threats of regulation, reputation, market opportunities and so on. But companies that want to manage the risks and realise the opportunities need a packaging sustainability strategy that's linked to broader sustainability goals and other corporate priorities with specific measurable targets and integrated across the business. So thank you. I'll now hand over to Jeff.
Thank you, Helen. All right, well, thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you, Helen. So yeah, thanks for the introduction earlier. My name is Jeff Vickers. I'm Technical Director at thinkstep. And today I want to talk to you about lifecycle thinking. And I'm going to use the example of milk packaging to kind of illustrate this. But first, I want to talk through a couple of broad concepts of lifecycle thinking, and then we can get into the case study. So broadly speaking, the goal of lifecycle thinking and its kind of sister concept, lifecycle assessment, is to avoid solving one problem by creating another. We want to avoid shifting burdens between lifecycle stages in time, between one country and another. We're trying to find the kind of quote unquote best outcome from an environmental perspective. And to do that, there's kind of two related concepts that enable us to help avoid burden shifting. And one is the idea of the product lifecycle metaphor. So it's something that we lifted from nature, like we do with so many things. We took the idea of a life cycle of something alive and we applied it to something dead. So we're taking raw materials out of the ground, or we're extracting something from a previous product life cycle. We're then using that to make the product that we need. We're then putting that in a truck and sending it somewhere. We're creating a final product. We're shipping that out to the customer where they use it and then eventually dispose of it. And then that either re-enters the same cycle again, or a different cycle, or ends up in a hole in the ground or an incinerator. And so the idea is that we take this life cycle metaphor and we quantify the environmental performance over that whole life cycle and try and relate that to a total that can be compared between product systems. Life cycle assessment is the kind of formal version of that, whereas life cycle thinking is the sort of more informal version of where you're just sort of doing it at a theoretical level. Related to that is the idea that we should look at multiple environmental indicators. So it's no good if you just avoid shifting problems between one life cycle stage and another, but you then do so by shifting problems from one environmental compartment to another. So for example, you decrease your energy use, but you increase your water footprint, or you increase your carbon footprint by decreasing the amount of nutrients you release to waterways. And so typically within life cycle assessment, we consider multiple environmental indicators together. And that can come across as a little scary, but at the same time, there are ways that you can kind of go through that that enable you to sort of use this information in a simpler way. And I hope to show that through the use of the tool towards the end of this demonstration. Finally, and sort of unrelated to those two concepts, there's the idea of a functional unit. So once you say we want to quantify everything, we want to put it in one sort of format to avoid burden shifting, we also want to make comparisons. And to make a proper comparison, you want to make it fair. And to do that, you focus on the need being met. So the kind of classic example is comparing pairs of dry hands. You're not looking at comparing a paper towel to another paper towel. You could do that, but you could equally compare a pair of dry hands to, that could be dried using a paper towel or a cotton roller towel or a Dyson air blade or any other kind of air towel that you can imagine. And then that functional unit of pairs of dry hands enables you to make comparisons between different kinds of product systems. So it enables you to get away from just what's currently on the shelf and get back to what the need being met is. So with those kind of three concepts in mind, I want to get into an example of milk, and specifically the functional unit of 1 litre of fresh milk at the consumer. So if we stop and think about how we might deliver that, we can deliver it in all kinds of different ways. In Australia and New Zealand, we typically use HDPE bottles, but we could also make those HDPE bottles out of recycled content, so rHDPE. Or we could make them out of bio-based content, so we've got bio-HDPE. On the market now, you see quite a few PET bottles, so we could have PET or recycled PET. We could have a carton, which is common in some size formats and very common in other markets. We could have glass like we've had in the past and still have today. That glass could be one way or it could be reusable. We could also go for a milk bag, like it's common in Canada, for example. So you buy bags of milk and you put it into a rigid container that pierces the bag and you pour out of that. Or you could do something even more kind of weird and wonderful, and you could go with teleportation. You're teleporting milk directly into your fridge. And my personal favorite, the idea of a domestic miniature cow, where you milk it yourself and refill your milk jug in your fridge using your own kind of ingenuity. And I've kind of been waiting during the COVID-19 lockdown. You see a lot of video bombing happening with people's kids kind of running in the background. I've been waiting for a cow to kind of appear and say, moo, and then shuffle out into the distance, but it hasn't happened yet. I'm still holding my hopes up that it will happen one day. Today, I want to focus in just on two of these examples, glass and reusable glass, to keep it a bit simpler. So if you look at the process of making a bottle, and particularly making it from raw materials, you're mining the sand and the other materials that you need. You're using heat to produce that in a glass furnace, and you're getting a glass bottle at the end. You're also then needing to seal that somehow, so you're producing a bottle cap. You've typically got a label, and then you need to package that up somehow to get it to the customer. So typically that's in some kind of crate that's put onto a pallet and then shipped out to the customer, where it then goes to them and then can either be single use, in which case it might be put in a landfill or recycled, or it can be reused and reused again. And so if we look at the single use bottle, it's relatively simple. It has an impact of X. You make the bottle, you make the cap, you make the label, and the number is whatever it is. But you could look at also from the perspective of a multi-use glass bottle, but you've got a little bit more of a complicated product system here. So you have to make the same bottle, but because you want it to be reusable, you probably also make it thicker. So you're adding a bit of extra glass. And then the bottle has to be washed because you want to reuse it again, so it needs to be clean for you to put new milk in. And then you've got to transport it to get the bottle back to wherever you're filling it, and then back to you again. And then finally, you've got the benefit from the fact that you are reusing it. So if you stack those two things up together, you start with that single-use bottle, you add on your thicker glass, you add on your cleaning stage, you add on your transport to get the thing to and from you, and you kind of reap the benefit from reuse. And you end up with something that looks a little bit like this. You've got a single use versus a multi-use, and it looks like the multiple use option is the best. So that's a kind of good outcome. You could also add to this comparison cartons, PET bottles, HDPE bottles, but just for simplicity, I'm just using these two. And so if we want to make this kind of real, we have to kind of get a bit nerdy here and put some real numbers around it, and then we can start to quantify it. So this is where we're taking life cycle thinking and translating it to life cycle assessment. So here you can see I've got 3 packaging layers: consumer, display, and shipment. And those packaging layers are sort of, consumer is what you take home with you, display is what's left in the supermarket when you leave, but it's where the products are displayed, and shipment is the packaging kind of behind the scenes to get it to and from the supermarkets or the shops. And you can see there we've got a range of different components. We've got the glass bottle with steel cap, we've got a polypropylene label, we've got some reusable crates, and we've got some reusable wooden pallets. And it's a lot of numbers, but we can kind of translate that using a tool to kind of work through and get to a kind of an answer. And so I wanted to introduce a tool that we have called the Garvey Packaging Calculator. And that's a tool for assessing the life cycle performance of packaging. It's designed for anyone to use, so it's not restricted to the kind of indoctrinated LCA kind of nerds in the background. Anyone can use it, whether that's a marketing department or a design team. It's still a little bit technical, but it's designed to kind of guide you through the process. And you can see a screenshot of it here. What I wanted to do very briefly, I'm conscious we don't have a lot of time, is just to show you how that example would look very briefly in the tool already worked through. So as any good TV chef does, here's one I've prepared earlier. And what you can see in the tool here is you can kind of open up the analysis and you can say, okay, let's have a quick look at that. And you can kind of browse through it and say, okay, well, let's look at the consumer packaging, for example. We know it's made of glass. And so here we've entered some information about the different glass bottle weights, 900 grams for the one way and 1400 grams for the reusable. You can specify transport distances to get it to you. You can look at, okay, we had a polypropylene label. So underneath here, we've got that polypropylene label. It's been, going through a filmmaking process. We're saying it's made in China. It's being shipped to Australia. We can include kind of all this kind of information for the different packaging layers. We've got the washing, we've got the distribution, we've got information at the end of life. And then finally, kind of once you enter all this information, you can just view results in real time and see, how do those two different packaging options stack up. And here you can see the consumer packaging, the impact in the reusable case is much lower, but, you've also got to wash the thing. So this particular thing here is about the washing stage, and you've got a higher impact from transport because you're going to get it back to the filling sort of depot and then back to you. So you can kind of compare both and you can analyze the trade-offs and you say, okay, the glass is looking good, but this is just taking it from a climate change point of view. What about kind of all other perspectives? And here we can look at a whole range of different environmental indicators together. Don't worry about what any of the numbers mean because it's meaningless to most people. But what you can see is a whole sea of green for the reusable glass. So these traffic lights, they go green when you've got more than 20% better than the alternative, and they'll go red if it's more than 20% worse and stay a light color when they're about equal. And what you can see here is across virtually all indicators, you're getting a kind of great performance. So based on this, you have to say that the reusable glass option is looking pretty good. So just flicking back into my slides very briefly to wrap up, because I'm conscious we're running low on time. You can build in lots of different information into a tool like this. So this is an example from APCO, the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation. They've done some great material flow analysis work, and they've got a tool called the PREP tool that many people on this call will be familiar with. And you can use those tools to provide inputs into a packaging calculator like the one I just showed. Similarly, you might be interested in non-life cycle metrics too. So here's an example of the material circularity indicator of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is also calculated through that tool. And it shows you some, 3 different options here of how an ideal recycled content and reused glass bottle would look compared to a kind of realistic case in the middle and a worst case on the right-hand side. And so I think I'll wrap up there, hand back to Barbara. And Barbara, if you want to take back control and go through any questions, that would be great. So thank you all for your attention.
We had one question coming in from Caroline, and that is, to what extent do you take recycling capabilities and recycling infrastructure into consideration, especially with the lack of capabilities or incoherent approaches across New Zealand currently?
Yeah, great question. And I guess my answer to that would be that the tool that we have allows you to specify a kind of real recycling rate. So you can use data on recycling rates that exist, and you can also use tools like the PREP tool to calculate kind of real world recyclability and enter that information in. So you can kind of set it for yourself based on your actual product.
And one more question from Rachel, that is there any way to take the Gavi tool through to compare recycling with reuse?
Yeah, so that example already included reuse in it. You could compare a recycling option as well at the other end, and yeah, you'd be able to compare reuse and recycling for sure.
There is a very specific question from Josephine. I would really like further understanding of the recyclability in New Zealand of coloured 1, 2, and 5 versus clear. Do you have resources? I think we all would like to know more about that.
Yeah, we can come back to you on that, although, generally speaking, coloured plastics just don't have the same value as clear plastics. So if you can stick to clear PET, natural HDPE, you're usually doing well, and avoid pigments where you can.
We have one other question, and that is, does Gavi Envision handle uncertain input data? For example, if exploring different distribution models.
Not really, although because you've got scenarios, you can have different sort of values there, so you can play around with different concepts. It doesn't have an explicit uncertainty kind of calculation in it, but you could probably calculate that back at the end if you really wanted to. But yeah, it's an interesting point. And perhaps one thing I should add is that I had to do a very light touch demonstration of this tool now. And so for those of you who are interested in seeing it in more detail, we will hold a follow-up session and you're very welcome to attend that. And so I think Barbara will probably post a little poll soon, and it might be in the follow-up questionnaire to ask if you'd like to attend that. So I'm conscious we had to kind of breeze through it.
So do let us know if you would like to take part and be invited to a specific calculated demonstration, because we didn't want to take up time during this webinar. Rachel Barker just offered to answer the questions on number 1, 2, and 5. So what I might do is I might just connect you after the webinar. Thanks, Rachel, for offering. There are a few more questions, but we really won't have time to answer them all. I will try to keep them all from the chat box as well. There was one here. Does it take into consideration onshore versus offshore recycling? And I think the very quick answer to that is yes, because we can take into account transport distances. So that would be the answer to that. Is consumer behavior taken into consideration in GABI calculations?
So insofar as you can enter like specific information, so you can specify your own recycling rates, your own rates of incineration, landfill, etc. So you can kind of, if you have done consumer testing, for example, for your product, or you've got specific survey information, you can enter that as it, based on what's real for your product.
And we'll make that the last question. Jennifer is wondering, when purchasing recycled materials, is there any way to measure how many times around a particular recycled resin has already gone? And does it even matter?
Certainly you can get discoloration with certain resins. So you get, for PET, the more it goes around and around the loop, the more it can get a tint, or it can go kind of hazy. And so sometimes they add virgin resin to it to sort of get around that. But I don't know if there's any way you can kind of measure, chemically how many times around it's gone. Someone else may know, but I don't.
I'm guessing from a sustainability point of view, it doesn't really matter so much because it does keep the material in the loop. And for plastics, as long as the resin doesn't lose quality, it probably doesn't really matter so much. For paper, it's a slightly different story, because every time you recycle paper and the fibers will get shorter and shorter, and the possibility to actually use them will be reduced. So there are materials that lose quality over time, and there are others that don't lose quality over time. We'll wrap it up here. Before we close, I will let you know that we have a few more webinars coming. So Jeff, if you could show that next one. We have got one on carbon, and that is specifically for SMEs, because the Science Based Target Initiative have created some resources and a streamlined approach for SMEs to set science-based targets. We're also holding an online workshop together with WWF Australia and the UN Global Compact on Scope 3 emissions. And our colleague Steve will be talking about timber's life cycle environmental performance. So if you're interested in registering for any of those, then check out our website. You can register there. Thanks again, Helen. And thank you very much also to Jeff. And with that, I wish you all a very good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.